Welcome once again to our Blackhawk Hockey Heritage Series, joined by a guy who was a grinder, also a goal scorer, the kind of guy that the coaches will tell you in their vernacular is the kind of guy you win with. We welcome our good friend Troy Murray, and right off the top, I want to get to something pristine, which I think brings out the dignity and brings out the sobriety of Troy Murray. Go back to your early days with the Chicago Blackhawks. Do you remember your first fight, and did you win?
Well, I remember it, and I didn't win. It was against Gordy Roberts, who played for the Minnesota North Stars, and I was fresh out of college, and I came up here, and of course you don't fight in college, and the only time prior to that was my junior days, which was 3 years before that, so very out of practice at that point, and I ran him in the corner, and I hit him really hard, and I turned away, and he said something behind me, and I turned around, and he says, you can't hit me and skate away like that, and you got to earn your stripes in the NHL, and the next thing I know, I was kind of swatting at his feet, and the fight was over, but I learned a good lesson early on that, you had to back up and you were held accountable for what you did on the ice.
You look at the mug right now, and you look terrific. You don't look a day over...
Very good doctors in the NHL.
You don't look a day over 35, but I'm going to guess you have at least 100 facial stitches.
Yeah, I would think so. I think that if you ever asked anybody and they says, how many stitches have you had, I don't think anybody can give you an answer because there's just too many, and for so many years you have them. It's just a situation that you kind of deal with them, and you never care whether there's 10 or 5, but they all add up, so I'm certainly sure that there's probably at least 100.
TM, let's go back to 1990. Blackhawks against Vancouver, and you know where I'm going.
Yeah.
The Blackhawk historian Bob Verdi, a prolific writer, wrote about this. Talk about the night you swallowed your teeth.
Yeah. Well, thanks for bringing that up. What happened is at an early age I had all my teeth knocked out. So at one point I had a bridge put in here just to kind of close the gap so I would look at least half decent. And there was a time in Vancouver, the game that you mentioned, I got hit with the puck right here. And the puck split my lip wide open right in half, and it just left a big gaping hole there. Mm-hmm. But what had happened, which nobody realized, it had hit me just at the right angle, that it popped out my bridge, and the bridge went into my throat. So Mike Gapsky, the athletic trainer, comes out onto the ice, and he sees the blood and automatically thinks that I'm cut bad and whatever. And he was asking me if I was okay, but I had, I couldn't talk because, I'm putting this together at a later point, because at that point I just really didn't know what was going on. I was kind of panicking, but the teeth were lodged in my throat. And I couldn't speak, couldn't answer Gapper, and their trainers came out on the ice, their team doctors came on the ice, the stretcher came on the ice, and I was carted off to the hospital. And at some point between the time that I got hit and left the ice and the time I got to the hospital, I'd swallowed my teeth.
You're honored, and justifiably so, by the franchise you love, with your own Heritage Night. I really would like to know this. Do you have a greater appreciation today for the Indian Head logo than you had, for example, when you were 23, 24 years old?
Well, you just asked that question. I got a little chill. I think that in a lot of ways you do, because as a player you just don't think it's ever going to end, and it's a joyride that's going on, and you kind of don't appreciate things in life until they're gone. And I think that when I walked into the building here today and saw the banners for Troy Murray Heritage Night, it really kind of struck. It was like, oh, this is cool. I mean, this is the NHL and the Chicago Blackhawks, and thank you so much, Rocky Wirtz, John McDonough, Jay Blanc, the organization, to celebrate the career that I had here. But you walk in and you kind of look at the feel that was going on, and you look back over your career and you say, well, this is something pretty special to be honored in front of a packed house here at the United Center with the greatest fans in Chicago.
When you joined this club out of North Dakota, where we're still investigating the fact that you were listed as an honor student.
Yes.
You walk into a locker room, and there's Al Secord, and there's Doug Wilson, and there's a collection of very veteran, very prolific hockey players, and you are all of 19 years old, coming out of college. I'm not going to ask you if you were in awe. I'm going to ask you, were you scared? Were you frightened?
You know what, at that point, the story was as I came out of the University of North Dakota, fresh off winning the NCAA championships in 1982. That was on a Saturday night. On Monday, I was in Chicago, and by Monday evening, I had signed my first professional contract with Mr. Wirtz, and Bob Pulford was the general manager and coach at that point. And the next day, I stepped onto the ice. There was so much excitement. involved in that whole weekend. And all of a sudden I'm playing in Chicago. It's been a lifelong dream. I was here, so I was too excited to really kind of understand what was going on. But I walked into the locker room and across from where my stall was, and of course I was in the the worst stall in the far corner of the locker room. But across the locker room was Tony Esposito, and Dennis Savard was in there, Daryl Sutter, Tom Lysiak, Al Seacard, all these guys, and I'm going, these are the guys that I've been watching on TV. And man, I'm in the same locker room with these guys. It was something pretty special. But again, you don't really kind of get a grasp on how special it was at that point because you were so excited and you were so young, and it was a great time of my life.
Well, if you can, again, we're going back in time, and we're talking about a window of
way back
28 years, almost 3 full decades. Who was the player or the players who took a young Troy Murray under their wings and really taught you how to be a professional?
Well, first of all, I will say, like Dennis Savard, I came up and I didn't have a place to stay, and Dennis Savard, who was still just very young at that point, but had a home in Elmhurst. He turned around and said to Troy, he says, "You come stay with me." And this is Dennis Savard, and I'm just a kid out of college, and he comes up, and I stayed with him for the remainder of that season. And after we lost out in the playoffs to Vancouver, Dennis went home to Montreal, and I didn't really know what I was going to do, and I was going to stay for the weekend, and Dennis said, "Well, just lock up when you leave." Gave me the keys to his car, gave me the keys to his house, and he said, "Enjoy it, and we'll see you next year in training camp," type thing. But as he was one guy that was very nice to me. But the guys back in those days, a guy like Tommy Lysiak was a centerman. There was Terry Wiskowski, who was the captain of that team, very respectful towards a young player coming in. Daryl Sutter was the captain after Terry Wiskowski left, and he was very good in helping the younger players come in. And it was it's kind of changed because the older players had the respect of the younger players. The younger players looked at the older players and kind of knew the pecking order. And not that it's changed now, but the pressures on young kids to come in and succeed at a younger age is a lot different than it was back then. And the older players kind of took care of the younger players. And there was a lot of guys in that locker room, and I don't know if I could single out one person.
The Elixir, the top of the mountain. It's one of the greatest bodies of work, in my opinion, a hockey player has ever put together. 85, 86, 45 goals, nearly 100 points. You win the Frank Selke Award as the game's top defensive forward. How many forwards, and don't give me the humble bit, how many forwards since '86 have put together a year that was that prolific?
You know what, I don't know. And the one thing that I was very proud of that year was the year that I won the Selke Trophy was the year that it kind of broke the mold of what that trophy was all about. It used to be, and no disrespect at all to a gentleman like Bob Gainey, who was tremendous defensively and worked hard and competed as hard as anybody, but he wasn't putting up offensive numbers. And all of a sudden they looked at my year and they said, "Well, gee, this guy is a great defensive player. He's gone head to head with Wayne Gretzky, with all the top players in the games, and he's done an excellent job. But look at his points. He's got 99 points on the season. That's pretty incredible." So there was a different kind of standard set at that point where it became more of a two-way player in a lot of ways, where you could say that this guy is great offensively and now he's great defensively as well. He's got the whole package, kind of like a Brian Trottier. But in his heyday, Brian Trottier wasn't considered as a Selke Trophy candidate because they were looking at basically a very defensive forward position. So the year that I won it, it was kind of, very breaking the mold, if you will say, as far as how they established the criteria of, who wins the Selke Trophy.
96, latter part of your career. You win what everybody covets in this game. You pick up a ring. You're a Stanley Cup champion with the Colorado Avalanche. If you could spend 3 good minutes each with Pat Kane, Jonathan Toews, Duncan Keith, Cristobal Huet, and explain what a ring means once your career is over, what would you tell them?
Don't waste any time while you're a player thinking that this year is not the year that it could be. Because if you sit there and you say, "Well, gee, we did well this year," you go into the next season and you think that you're going to have the same results as you did last year. The Blackhawks had a great playoff last year. Great run by for the first time in a long time they got into the playoffs. And they expect it to happen this year. You expect to go further. but it doesn't happen every year. I mean, it was the only time in my career that I ever made it to the Stanley Cup Finals, and we had great teams, and we thought, well, next year will be our year, and next year will be. But everybody thinks that, and you can't take anything for granted that it's going to be the same next year. Teams change from year to year. The group of guys that are in the locker room change from year to year, and what you have special within a locker room on any given season is what you have to appreciate, and really. Until you win the Stanley Cup, you don't realize how hard it is to win that championship. And I was very fortunate in Colorado to play with guys in the top of their game. Peter Forsberg, Joe Sakic, Patrick Waugh was our goaltender there. So great, tremendous individuals. But I don't know if that team could have won the Stanley Cup without the additions of a guy like Patrick Waugh, who had won the Stanley Cup in Montreal. We picked up Mike Keane, who was the captain of the Montreal Canadiens. You know, for these guys here, they added John Madden, which is important because he can tell these guys, it's not going to happen every year. This is something very special. Take it for what it is this year. Don't look to next year because there's no promises next year.
True or false? You're in Colorado. A guy by the name of Joel Quenneville is an assistant coach.
Joel.
And the first time he sees Troy Murray, his reaction is, maybe I'll become a used car salesman.
Yeah, well, you know what? Joel was great, and now I see Joel come full fold. And for Joel, he was a young assistant coach in the National Hockey League, and you know, at times we carpooled together to go to the airport. And Joel, you know, I remember we'd come back at 2 o'clock in the morning, and he'd have a cigar and drive back in the car, and we'd talk about the game. And now you see him as a head coach, and he's really, you know, evolved into a tremendous coach, a tremendous individual, which he always knew, because back when he was an assistant coach, and you become closer to an assistant coach because their job is more so to help you as an individual. The coach has the overall pictures, but an assistant coach can kind of step forward and work with you more one-on-one, and Joel was that type of person. And you know, I remember playing against Joel. He was a big, strong, stay-at-home defenseman type of player, and that's the way he kind of approaches the game. It's no nonsense, and everything is business. But at the same time, when you walk away from the rink, you have to have enjoyment away from the rink, because that's what brings happiness to the rink as well.
You know, obviously, every sport evolves. In the case of hockey, there is such a premium on speed, first step quickness today. Most of the rough stuff has gone by the wayside.
Yeah.
I mean, I recall back in the 80s when you were playing, if it was a rivalry game deep in March or in the playoffs, I always figured it was a major upset if there weren't 5 major penalties in the first 15 minutes.
There was something to say about the entertainment value of those games back in those days, because you know, the league was a little bit, you know, the goaltenders didn't have the equipment that they have today, and it's not that the goaltenders were worse or whatever, but there was more scoring back in those days. So it wasn't uncommon that you would have 7-8 goals in a game, and then you would have 4 or 5 fights in a game, especially if it was in the Old Norris division. And I'll tell you what, I mean, you knew that if you weren't prepared to play those games in the Old Norris division with Minnesota, when they had Willie Plett, Dino Cicerelli, who, you know, fans would remember the Dino dolls that they hung in the old Chicago Stadium. You know, you had guys in Toronto like Wendell Clark. You had Basil McRae, you had Probert in Detroit with Joey Kosher. Shane Churley was with Basil McRae in Minnesota. I mean, it was an all-out battle. And going back to when I first came in here, you know, I line up one time and there's a guy named Willie Plett standing across from me. And well, you know, Willie Plett was, you know, a monster in my mind. And here I am, just a, you know, fresh kid out of a school, 19 years of age, and I'm lining up against one of the toughest guys that, you know, ever played the game. And you know, it was a different kind of feeling, I think, that it was in those days compared to what it is now, because the threat of a fight breaking out back in the old days was pretty common, and if you weren't prepared to battle it, you couldn't survive in the NHL.
I mean, you've become a prolific broadcaster. You and John are just a great listen. I know you come down for the morning skates, but how much time will you spend before a broadcast getting ready?
You know what, I mean, that's the thing, is you know, you don't have an appreciation for the other side of it, for the media side of it, of how much work actually goes into, you know, preparation. And I worked with Pat Foley on the TV broadcast when we were doing a simulcast with the radio as well. And you know, Pat was one of the best to learn from in that business. And you do put in a lot of work. I mean, you have to know the players, you have to know the background, and it's not something you can have on a piece of paper. You have to know it in the top of your head, because you don't have time to look through your notes to figure out where this guy played from, where he grew up, what his background, what his relationship is, where these guys have fought before in the minor leagues or something like that. So you have to do a lot of in-depth research on the teams that you're playing against especially, and it's a lot more work than I ever thought it would be, but very enjoyable for me to be working along with John Weideman, who in my opinion is just one of the best announcers in the game, and we have some great chemistry up in the radio booth, and on a day-to-day basis, I just love my job.
During the Chicago years, wow, a lot of great hockey players. If you had to pick out one guy and say, this guy might not necessarily have been the best player we had, but by gosh, if I had to go to war, this is the teammate I wanted. Who was your best teammate in Chicago?
Well, there was Eddie Olczyk, and I got to put his name in here.
Well,
but no, I'm not. But I'm just saying he was my line mate.
But when you guys played together, he had to carry you.
He did. Good old, Eddie Olczyk, Kurt Fraser, and myself, the Clydesdale line. But I guess if I had to say, pick a player, the player that I would say is Dirk Graham. Very underrated, a tremendous leader, but a guy that played a large majority of his career in the minor leagues. And when he got to the NHL, he had a much greater appreciation of being in the NHL and what it took to play in the NHL and how valuable it was to play in the NHL, because he did have a background come from the minor leagues, and he appreciated everything that he had at the NHL level, and not one practice, not game did he take off. And for all the players that I had, I think I would look at Dirk Graham and say, listen, this is the guy I want to go to battle with. And he was my line mate for many years after Eddie left and after Kurt Fraser left.
Today's guys are chartering. They're chartering.
These guys have no idea.
How much do you miss 5:45 a.m. wake-up calls in Los Angeles to play that night in Chicago?
I mean, it was incredible, and you know what I mean. It's professional sports. It's big business. It's the way it should be. But for so many years, we would go through the normal security at O'Hare Airport. We'd wait in the in the holding area, the gate area, and we'd jump on, and the rookies got the middle seats on a commercial flight, and that's just the way it was. There was no food, there was no anything special. I mean, you were with everybody else, and today's game has changed. They have great nutrition, which is important for them, and our routine back in the old days when we went on the road was everybody threw their bags in the hotel room, met down in the lobby, and went to the little local watering hole, and 11 o'clock at night for curfew, you'd come back, and by 11:30 the whole hallway would be sprinkled with pizza boxes.
Still true to this day. Long-time hockey, unwritten rule, part of the code. The coach has the bar at the hotel. The players go elsewhere.
Well, that kind of still is the code. It's usually the hotel establishment is off limits for players, and that's just kind of the way it should be.
My friend, take a look at Duncan Keith, putting together a great body of work. It might not necessarily be Doug Wilson when he won the Norris, or Chris Chelios when he won a pair of Norris trophies, but this guy is prolific. Right now, if you had to cast a ballot tonight,
he'd win.
Would he win?
I think so. And I talked about it last year. Duncan Keith really kind of came into his own last year, but he wasn't on the radar for anything, for a Norris Trophy winner. He wasn't on the radar as one of the top defensemen in the NHL, but he opened everybody's eyes last year as an all-star for the Chicago Blackhawks. And everybody says, well, gee, look at this Duncan Keith guy in Chicago. Well, now he is on the radar. He's on the Canadian Olympic team. And in my opinion, if you look at the defensemen across the NHL, some of the top defensemen that have won it in the past aren't having as great a seasons as they normally would. Chara last year for Boston, who was the Norris Trophy winner, has been off to a slow start this season. Nicholas Lidstrom, for the first time in his career, looks like he's slowing down a little bit. Mm-hmm. The next group of defensemen is led by Duncan Keith. And in my opinion, if you took a poll right now throughout the National Hockey League, Duncan Keith would be the Norris Trophy winner.
How would Troy Murray, the hockey player, want to be remembered?
I think if I could be remembered for anything, it's the dedication and hard work that I put into the game to be the best player that I could be. It's not all about playing the games. It's all about how you approach and prepare for games, how hard you practice. And I take a lot of pride in the fact that I could play at both ends of the ice, an all-around player and a two-way player. So for me to win the Selke Trophy said that I was very good defensively, And for me to have 45 goals one year says that I was good offensively. And to me, you can do both. You don't have to be a one-way player, and that's what I'd like to be remembered
So
for.
in other words, right now, you have the greatest feeling, in my opinion, a professional athlete can possibly have. When you look in the mirror in the morning, you can say to yourself, I never stole a goal.
I'm bald.
Well, my friend, congratulations on the Heritage Night. Congratulations on a marvelous career. And I want you to know that you're taking bread out of my mouth by being a broadcaster.
Chet, thank you so much. You know, you were the first guy that I worked with, and I'm still here.
And you survived.
I survived it.
We thank Troy Murray. And don't forget, once again, this has been a part of our Chicago Blackhawks Hockey Heritage Series. Again, we thank a guy who is the kind of guy you win with. Troy Murray, commit to the Indian Head.